than this. It's a compounding accounted for, is the propensity matching.
Okay. Do you wanna do all of that? That's next level. Now that's not 2 days, now that's like a couple weeks, but.
I'll send you. Right, I would rather.
Actually, I think I have.
Yeah.
So you
And say, this is why we need to study.
I thought you were talking about that. Actually, Manoj, I think, does have those skills himself too.
Yeah.
Whether he has the bandwidth, I don't know, but he does that. Otherwise, I have other staff people who could do that kind of.
So
far, so good.
Andrew and Manoj sit like this.
That's
in my lab.
super good. Just let them work together.
Yeah,
If they get called for help, they'll call for help, but that might be very productive.
Where
way
they
of doing it.
literally sit facing each other in my lab.
artifacts like that.
Don't do it. Just wanted you to know that's what the plan is. So if you see a paper come to your way with your name on it.
I see for vet, yeah, that was some kind of, whatever. I don't know what that says. What are you asking me for?
Management, how they can do all these things, they're still in the process of discussing everything with the HR team, with the accounting team and stuff, they're like, oh no, we're not sure yet.
Yeah, I'm aware of some of this. Okay, sounds good. As far as I know though, like the high level stuff is done. At least the process.
Is that looking like what you want it to look like?
Yep, close enough.
Did you, oh, you got your food? And you want a drink?
Sure, I have water.
Yeah, unless you want to grab, see if you can grab something. Last minute bathroom break?
Sure.
Good, how are you?
Where's that?
I thought you would. Yeah. No problem.
We should like build really hard human.
You just don't want anybody to forget me. So much I picture myself.
I feel bad for like hijacking the office. No, should be here.
Yeah, I think we should.
I still have to leave the office for
True.
or disturb you.
To get like some earphones and expensive.
So you know that camera is looking at you basically.
Yeah, actually, this is a not
Mic or
well.
mic is covered.
Just talk loudly. This ceiling has a microphone basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear everything just we know each other
do things all the time.
You did do with your foundation model for different settings.
In a couple minutes, and I'll start with mostly letting you introduce yourself. So glad to have you here. About yourself.
Good to know. I think it's an hour, right?
Yeah, so the age was I didn't know. But you can hear, but now Dan is there, so he can talk to patients.
2-3 minutes of sharing about
So
yourself.
I find that very disturbing because like, you know, they don't
Right.
do that.
Right.
Like, should I start this medication? No.
I do something different. When I write plans or do stuff, I play music. A little bit of instrumental music. I don't know if John can hear that.
Carmen, what's going on?
So he can hear everything that you say in your meetings.
Oh, yeah.
And now
I
I.
learned all his secrets, like, oh, I'm copying that grant idea, copying that one.
A ton of pizza yesterday.
But I could hear Dan talking to a patient that telling me I'm like, take this medication. No. And I'm like,
Yeah, these walls are not very effective. I've just abandoned all hope. I often give like Zoom webinars out of my reading, and I talk pretty loudly when I do that. I'm sure you've heard my talk multiple times.
When I write plans or papers, I play music. I wonder if you hear that.
Well, I deliberately wear noise canceling headphones when I work, when I play music, because I'm trying to tune out.
That for like 2 hours after that, I'm like, oh.
Right.
Because that requires fundamental multimodal requires history.
I can't have anything over the, yes, I
Treatment is
get a
so
headache.
for a while, so really can evaluate.
People online, we're gonna get started in just a few minutes, let people inside, grab their food, start sit down.
People are actually sick, like your shot's really challenging. It's a big neuro band.
I think this is a record. I just talked to you.
15% of people. Quite.
I think it's also like we have the dinners.
Just did. Just. Get humans to do the task is something that we can have because that's like a perfect student project. It's really just corralling. Patients.
You seem to be good at corralling.
Can I sit here?
Just up on top of that,
Oh, I am.
How do you imagine like the challenge of all these like interface? How do you present the data? How do I sort of how to handle that?
Oh,
I'm close. It's up and running. I just haven't been. It's like not my number one priority list right now, but like hopefully by the end of the week or end of next week.
All right, more people are trickling in, but I wonder if we might be able to start informally, take advantage of some of our time with Dr. Koyejo. Real pleasure and a privilege to have you here with us. Can you start just telling us a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up? How did you end up studying what you're studying? Why? There's so many other things you could have done with your life. Just tell us about yourself.
Well, first, real pleasure to be here. Good to see lots of familiar faces and new ones. I'll say I've had a bucket list item to make it to this part of campus for a while and never got the right excuse. So I'm very happy that this is sort of feels to do this in person and be here. I've been at Stanford, maybe I'll go backwards.
Yeah. Graduate student, postdoc,
Sure.
got their career directions. How did you figure it out for yourself?
Wow, okay. You should have warned me about the level of sort of deep inquiry.
Yeah.
So I've been at Stanford 2 years now. I used to be faculty at the University of Illinois, which is where I got interested in healthcare work. Where I was working with local hospitals to do a variety of things, including ongoing work on breast cancer screening for sort of hospital consortia. So some fun stuff in algorithmic fairness, some distribution shift stuff, so I'll come over here, federated learning, a bunch of fun things. Here I lead the Stanford Trustworthy AI Research Lab, which thinks of its mandate as engaging broadly in how to build trustworthy AI systems. So this goes all the way from questions like measurement all the way to mitigation when we find issues. Perspectives include robustness, tied to what I'm gonna talk about once again, other than like fairness, security, privacy, all that fun stuff, and sort of building employee AI systems. And we're a big fan of healthcare application areas, so we talk to some people in this room and many other places to find partners to think about potential applications of some of the tooling to hopefully meaningfully solve some real applications, or at least move the needle. You know, it's hard in real world healthcare settings. Let me see. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. Moved to the US for undergrad. I've been all around the country, which is really fun. Undergrad in the East Coast, Texas for grad school, did a short postdoc here in psychology. That's all interesting. And then Illinois for postdoc. And sorry, Illinois for faculty for selected position. And then a couple years ago.
It sounds like you came into healthcare, but you weren't always. So what did you used to work on, and what made you do that shift, or what mattered?
Yes, I've always been great question. I've always been the actual answer may be fun, we'll see. But I've always been a sort of very applied oriented ML person. So I find that like good inspiration for thinking about problems and grounding things. So my PhD work was mostly sort of a core ML, like statistical machine learning kind of problem. And towards the end, I ended up, it's a weird fun thing that the leading package at the time, it's a fun side anecdote, was scikit-learn, which is still a thing, but you know, PyTorch is more a thing now. And some of you may or may not know this, but actually, most of the people that build scikit-learn are actually neuroimaging people, neuroscience and neuroimaging people. Actually, not like necessarily. I mean, they're core ML to the extent that they engage people in the field. But I went to a talk because I was interested in sort of that side of it. Like, you know, these guys are talking about some of the scikit-learn things. And through that, I got connected to folks in neuroscience. And I got excited by their problems, which is sort of complicated, high-dimensional like learning problems with limited data and lots of expert knowledge. And so I ended up spending time, and that's what led to the postdoc. So I was doing sort of ML for neuro kinds of things. At Illinois, I was, you know, from the point of view of a computer scientist, this is maybe the fun side anecdote. I was sort of obscure enough that I looked like someone doing human-y related things. And I kept getting incoming for healthcare type stuff. And at some point I was like, okay, I'll just give this a shot.
Just give it.
And it turned out to be like a great decision. So, you know, it's maybe a fun anecdote. Maybe. I don't know how, you know, I don't know if it's good guidance for anything that you might do, but I try to take, you know, interesting opportunities as they come, and it worked out well enough that I'm happy with some of the outcomes. But I think the actual path was weirdly circuitous and non-standard. I think hopefully now I'm useful, but we'll see. But I wouldn't say that it was sort of it was the obvious route that maybe other people end up with or go through to end up here. It was more exposure to the problem, seeing some of the impacts, getting excited about potential projects and kinds of work that we could do, and then sort of slowly adding on to where it became a big part of the work I'm excited about.
Fantastic. Well, we're glad you're here, and please take it away. We're very excited to hear about your work.
Yeah, love the probing and the intro questions. So, you know, we're all friends now. You know, so we can have a nice conversation. So my talk today is part position, part tutorial, part some lessons learned over honestly mostly like the PhD length of one student I mentioned whose work is going to drive most of what I'll talk about today, where we've been engaging in various versions of the sort of what I think is a core problem in machine learning and AI, the distribution shift problem. And so to my mind, I think the clearest test of, or maybe in recent memory anyway, one of the most striking tests of whether machine learning is useful in healthcare, to my mind, was around COVID. And so, you know, many of us were working from home, obviously, maybe not many of you for very important reasons, but particularly machine learning and AI people, you know, this seemed like the chance to do something useful. And I think there were lots of us in the field who, I did some of this, again, I imagine many of you, attempted to do various kinds of predictive machine learning tasks around COVID. So detection things, diagnosis things, prognosis things, like a whole bunch of stuff around can be useful there. And, to bury the lead a bit, most of it actually was not that useful. And again, many of you already know this. And there's a whole diagnosis of what broke, and there may be multiple explanations, and it's in many ways a complicated story. But I think one salient part of what broke, and has been repeated a few different times, is that a lot of what happened is that people built AI models in a hospital based on local cohort, or based on found data online, which is another failure mode that I think, and tried to deploy it in some other setting, and it just wasn't useful in the setting that you were deploying it in. And so, to my mind, this, again, to the extent that you think this is a first order, higher order bit of the failure of a lot of the ML AI work, to me, this is a striking example of the effect of distribution shift on performance of a machine learning model. So again, said explicitly, the thing that broke here was that people were trying to transfer models from one place to another. And the models didn't work. And I am, I guess, claiming, and I'll hopefully say in a bit more detail, that to the extent that that was the higher order failure, the diagnosis there is that, in the ML sense, sorry, wrong room for you, diagnosing things. But the cause there was a distribution shift problem that led to sort of failure when deployed. And so many of you might have seen versions of this in lots of application areas where you might be trying to use machine learning problems. And I'll talk through some of what we think we know about this issue and sort of where it shows up. Part of this will also engage with some of how the field has been changing recently, because I think particularly large scale and foundation models have changed some of how we frame the distribution shift problem. So I'll engage with this question. So what is distribution shift? So a way that I like to set this up is the way we teach our classes. I think anyone here has been in my ML AI course, but many of you almost definitely taken a machine learning or artificial intelligence course at some point. You will almost always hear like some ID type of assumption, which effectively means we assume that the real world looks like the data we're training our model on. And in fact, if that contract breaks, all bets are off in terms of machine learning 101, at least the way that we think about it formally and sort of often the way we teach it. While this is how we think about the problem, and this is where machine learning tools are strongest, I'm realizing how jarring it must be to come into the room and like have to fix everybody.
Pointing it out, right?
And I just made it worse, of course. Sorry, but it's great work now. But indeed, this is actually almost never true in the real world. I'll speak more to this in a little bit, but almost always, despite the sort of storytelling in our like pedagogy and often how we even build tools, there's almost always a shift between the data that you train on and data you're going to deploy on. Lots of examples of this. I'm going to show an example from a sort of recent-ish paper, and I'm showing this because I think it also highlights a version of sort of the classic framing of the distribution shift problem in machine learning and AI work, and some of the tooling and sort of successes and failures that people use to engage in this problem. So here's some work. There's called a BIRDS data set out of this concept bottleneck, which is I think a clever paper. But I'm highlighting this because a few reasons. But the actual thing that they attempted to do here was take birds that are either sort of outdoor urban kinds of birds or sort of more forest kinds of birds. The task is to classify which kind of bird species it is. And it's well known, and many of you might already know, that if I, because of the sort of nature of natural data, if I give this to a machine learning model, it tends to get pretty good at classifying the bird type. But if you look a bit deeper, what you might find is that it's actually really good at classifying the environment type and not the bird type. And so it will sort of pick up on forest and sort of use forest to classify. Like if you perturb a bit its labeling process and try to investigate, you'll find that the signal that it seems to be anchoring on is not the thing you wanted, which is to figure out what kind of bird it is. It's a correlate of it, which is like most forest type birds show up in forests most of the time. And models will pick up that correlate. And in some ways, the signal is much stronger that it's a forest kind of environment. And it's sort of easy statistical association. Models are good at this, is what ML and AI models are good for. As sort of first order, is picking up statistical correlates. You'll pick that up, you get high performance, but arguably you haven't solved the test that you wanted to solve. And in fact, and what this data set attempted to do explicitly is move maybe in a partially gross to humans way, but as maybe this example, but move the bird to a different environment via sort of explicit manipulation, so that if the model was using, maybe you can think about this as a way to test that the model might be using that as a correlate for prediction. If the model was using environment and not the actual bird type, then this would break the evaluation. So you pick this up if I evaluate it by sort of this explicit perturbation. And so this is sort of both a good test for whether models have a particular compound. Also ended up being a good data set to try to train sort of more robust models. And a lot of hundreds and hundreds of papers using this data set and sort of variants of this kind of idea. The other common one is camel and desert, if you've seen this. There are other fun ones, Arctic fox and snow, all these examples, all sort of saying the same thing. There's a fun one in a healthcare setting. This is published a few years ago. I don't think anyone is an author in this room, but folks around here. So this is from Stanford colleagues. And they're interested in predicting collapsed lung. And some of you might already know the story. If you don't, allow me to regale you. So they created data sets. This is a very reasonable task, you might imagine, and potentially quite clinically useful if it works well to help with sort of diagnosis, triage, that kind of deal for a patient that comes in. And what they ended up finding is that the model, off the cuff on a training and even like a standard test set worked quite well. As you might know, there's a standard treatment for a collapsed lung, which is sort of putting in this tube that drains the fluid. And so what was found as a sort of post-evaluation is that you could explain the quality of the model's prediction much more by the presence or absence of this tube than by the actual condition being diagnosed. So what was found was that the model picked up on this tube artifact, got good classification performance, arguably by being able to predict the presence or absence of this tube. But if you go back to the actual clinical task that motivates this problem, this is not useful because what I really care about is be able to tell ahead of time, so semi-automatically this sort of condition. And what I'm actually getting out is, have I treated the condition, which is after the thing I actually wanted to detect. So, in terms of construction of a training data set and the problem setting, it's self-consistent in terms of usefulness in the real world, arguably not. And the argument here is, again, this is a spurious correlation. Again, here, maybe a part of diagnosis is like the data set construction hit this particular correlate. And if it wasn't tested appropriately, sort of an easy failure mode, because again, ML tools are good at picking up statistical correlations. I will pick up sort of the easiest predictive signal effectively. You have this inductive bias, if you like. And so we use that to make the prediction. Okay, so lots of fun problems. Shows up often in many other ways. A lot of my work is very interested in fairness applications and sort of equity issues broadly. Often one of the ways that these issues show up is, again, via sort of this kind of spurious correlations. Many of you already know about this Overmeyer paper. That engages with some spurious correlations tied to demographics. Again, showing some of these gaps that can occur in practice where models are picking up correlates that are not actually meaningful for, arguably, for the decision problem that we choose to implement and deploy them for. So, circa, I guess, early 2020s, there seemed to be a revolution in the field where foundation models became a thing. And so this was super exciting for many reasons. I think, the idea of foundation models was really large machine learning models that were trained on sort of lots and lots of data, often multimodal, but even if you're picking a single mode, just across lots of different data sources. And they seem to have the property, I think, saliently for folks in this field, they seem to have the property that sort of many of the quote unquote toy distribution shift problems that we used to build bespoke machine learning models for, foundation models and related ideas seem to just solve zero shot out of the box, or with a little bit of fine tuning. And so, I put sort of LLMs in this bucket as well. Again, very large models trained on lots of data. Vision language models are roughly in this box. Again, they tend to be large. They tend to be trained on sort of lots of data from lots of different sources. I think it's another one of those things where it depends a bit on your perspective. If you are interested in solving the problem, the fact that there seems to be a tool that solves the problem, zero shot, meaning, I don't do anything special. I do a little bit of special stuff, but not nearly as much work as I would do to train a special model. I don't have specific knobs or things that I'm tuning. I'm just sort of taking a model, but a big model, but still a model off the shelf and applying it. From one point of view, this is great. It solved my problem. If you're a researcher, you may or may not have a bit of existential sort of fun with this because there's hundreds of papers that seem to be invalidated, specialized techniques, just based on sort of some other approach that seems to address the problem. And I'll talk a bit about this because I think it's meaningful for some of what we think we now know about understanding the nature of distribution shifts in various applications. I forgot to change this. I had planned to change this to healthcare version of the slide. This is some of the things I was planning to do in the last 5 minutes. But it doesn't matter. People have used this in lots of different ways across lots of different applications. Here's one in some computer vision versions of this, some papers that do this. Many people here building healthcare models, healthcare foundation models are engaging in this. The point I'm trying to make, despite maybe a slight bit of pun in my narrative, is that this really is a very successful approach for solving lots of problems. And in particular, it seems to mitigate lots of the distribution issues, shift issues that we had for a long time in the field that we seem to need very bespoke models for. So this paradigm of training very large models across lots of different data sources and either applying them zero shot or doing a bit of fine tuning for the target task. And I'll get at this a little bit more in a second. Another part of the distribution shift question is the measurement question. So, often we build benchmarks and these benchmarks are meant to capture shift robustness. And actually some of the most interesting versions of these are designed in principle to capture worst case shift robustness. So the idea is, want to get closer and closer to sort of what kinds of things might happen in the real world. We think that in some cases, the real world gives us like extremely broad shifts that are extremely different from wherever original data set source that we came from. And so we want to build tools that allow us to measure how good a particular methodology is, or how good a particular model or approach might be for worst case kinds of shifts. I'll engage with this more as well a little bit. And so there's been lots of work in the field on this. I'm showing a few papers, some closer to either sort of healthcare adjacent. This Changes Hard paper has lots of healthcare examples, but also some other general ones, so things like Chexpert, other fun ones. Wilds out of colleagues, not across the street, but a few minutes away. Sort of a popular data set looking at, again, trying to engage with benchmarks of distribution shift. So lots of work in the field trying to measure, so help us understand how good we are at learning with distribution shift. And in particular, this question of worst case distribution shift. And other things that we thought we learned from some of this exercise, I think one of the more fascinating ones was this phenomenon called accuracy on the line. So if you haven't seen this, it's a sort of intriguing observation. What they did was look at these data sets with sort of multiple data sources, trained a variety of different models, evaluated, do the standard train test split thing in training the models. You look at the test performance in the training domain. And you also measure test performance in some downstream held out test domain that is intentionally designed to be distribution shifted. So it's sort of different from the data that you trained on. And the intriguing observation was that it seemed that the in-domain and out-of-domain behavior or performance was linearly correlated. So, why would you care? Well, if this phenomenon holds, this means that I actually may not need to spend a lot of effort thinking very carefully about how my model will do out of distribution. I can simply check what it does in distribution. And actually, if it's actually literally like a XY line, X equal Y line, that's the best case. I actually don't need to do any work. I can predict immediately how my model will do out of distribution based on its in distribution performance, because this is again, a kind of, you call it a scaling curve, you call it a test transfer curve, depending on what you want to call it. But the key thing I'm hoping to anchor on here is this phenomenon is extremely useful because it helps you predict what might happen when you deploy your model. Simply by evaluating what happens in the standard training setup. And so, to the extent this is true, this is a little bit incredible because, distribution shift problems and particularly worst case distribution shift problems are known to be hard problems. But here's a finding that suggests perhaps that, whatever it is, however hard they might be, I don't need to do anything special for them. I can simply use, and this ties a bit to the foundation model phenomenon as well. I can simply use sort of in-domain performance as a proxy for guessing what I would do out of domain. So again, intriguing, super interesting. Something that, at least for some parts of the field, showing a few different papers, lots of papers have engaged with this question. It seemed to be a fairly stable phenomenon. And so you can think about a summary of the claims I've made so far. As on the modeling and estimation side, maybe foundation models fix our distribution shift issues. On the evaluation side, and in particular, maybe even thinking about worst case behavior benchmarks, accuracy in the line seems to fix our out of distribution shift measurement question, meaning I don't need a special measurement for worst case. I can simply use whatever's happening in domain. I could end the talk here, given that we have half an hour. We'll have to say more. So I'm going to argue that this is not the end of the story. So there's been lots of work. Again, another symptom of maybe insufficient copy pasting is that I don't have all the examples I wanted from healthcare context, but I'll give some examples from other contexts. Here's an example from translation context where what we showed was the performance of the translation task was highly dependent on sort of how close the translation target was to data that the model had seen or that we sort of can get to fine tune. So this is suggesting, while foundation models seem to have solved lots of our distribution shift questions, there seems, at least empirically via experiments at this point, there seem to be some cases where things are still fragile. And the fragility seems to correlate reasonably with some of what we thought was true in distribution shift anyway, meaning the closer your test domain is to your training domain, the better the model seems to transfer. And I'm anchoring on this because this is 2024. So this is, again, we're using a very large foundation model. We're doing all those sort of state-of-the-art stuff. We're still finding some gaps. And here the gap is tied to the fact that, despite the breadth and the size of the model, it hasn't seen some of the translation targets that we're interested in solving. Similar things show up if you have sort of an obscure enough task that's far enough away from the task that the model has been trained on. So here I'm showing some work where we're interested in solving what is called auto-formalization. So this is a task where I'm trying to get informal mathematical statements into a formal mathematical statement that can be solved using a formal theorem proof or something like lean. And so this is useful if you're interested in AI for sort of program synthesis, AI for proofs, all that kind of stuff. It's a bit out of distribution of most LLM data sources. So it's sort of a bit of an obscure task from the standard LLM world, though, for folks who work in this area, this is the problem they want to solve. And the key claim I'm making here is there's another instance, the task is sort of a little bit weird and obscure compared to what the model has seen during training. And maybe not a surprise, but we're showing that the correlation, the alignment between what the model has seen and the task we want to solve, again, seems to be showing up as sort of an explanation of potential failures of the models and like a place where we need new mitigations. You can say a similar, I can complicate the story in a similar way on the benchmark side. I'm mostly going to refer to other people's work. So after some of the early work on accuracy in the line, there was follow-up work that considered potential other explanations, looked at more benchmarks, and the first set of stories suggested, perhaps we still see this correlation between training and out of distribution, or tests in distribution, out of distribution performance, but it's a bit more complicated. So it's no longer a nice clean line, which is in some cases the easiest to be able to predict or out of. It's now some nonlinear thing, but it's still predictable. It's just we now need to fit a nonlinear line as opposed to a straight line. This is not that bad in practice. So, it's a one-dimensional learning problem, right? We're just fitting a line. Statistics 101. So if this was as far as it got, maybe this would be fine. There's other work that's also looked at the literature, and their main takeaway was that they think most of what the benchmarks are capturing are fairly simple kinds of distribution shifts. So this is a critique of the benchmarking process. This is saying the phenomenon you're seeing, which is easy prediction of out of distribution performance, is perhaps better explained by the fact that the task that you're actually solving with your view of benchmark is actually much simpler than you thought it was. It's sort of simple shifts that look like covariate and label shifts. I'll talk about them in a couple of minutes if you're not familiar. And this might actually be the explanation for why we're seeing accuracy in the line phenomenon. So, hopefully I've complicated the story for you. That was my goal. It's complicated in two ways. On the modeling side, I've at least shown a couple of examples that suggest that if you have sort of interpolation-like things, foundation models are great and seem to be a good solve for the problem. But the further things look like interpolation-like problems, there's still gaps. At least in, I guess arguably I'm a bit conflicted here in the story I'm trying to tell, but we've done some work that suggests that things can break. And similarly on the benchmark side, again, hopefully suggested the story may be more complicated. Hopefully I'll resolve this by the end of the talk today, suggesting that this predictability of performance out of distribution from in-distribution performance may actually be a reflection of sort of, if you like, simpler measurement processes compared to what we wanted. So we designed something, we implemented it. It turns out maybe the argument here, or the conjecture, maybe hypothesis, is perhaps we are measuring something simpler than we thought we were measuring. And perhaps it may actually not be that easy to predict out of distribution performance from in-distribution performance. So for you, why may this be important? Again, if the prediction was easy, then this says that I don't need to attack, or well, you can think about it a bunch of different ways, but I think the most important one might be if I can predict what I expect to do out of distribution simply by looking in distribution, then it solves the sort of, I can tell when I've sort of done a good enough job without having to engage specifically in like the target task, simply by looking in distribution, as long as the tasks are within, or can be thought of as shifts of each other. So, as a phenomenon, quite useful. My questioning of it should make some of you disappointed. If it's not, I'll question it more. Okay, so that's it. So maybe as a TLDR for most of the talk today, I think my main messages are twofold. So one, I'd like to argue that we haven't completely solved distribution shift. It's still an AI problem. I think we've made meaningful progress, and I'll touch on lots of places where I think we've made progress, but I think there's still places where there's sort of open questions and work to do. We think we have pretty good solutions, and I'll again ground this more on settings that look a bit like interpolation or close to interpolation. What I'll end up showing is extrapolation can be tricky, but they're partial solves if we have target data or if we know enough about the problem to make strong modeling assumptions. And then on the measurement side, my main message will be a bunch of these benchmarks that are meant to capture OOD here as out of distribution performance. I'll argue that they may not be measuring actual worst case out of distribution performance. They actually may be too simple, but there are ways to fix. Fix here means fix our measurement of the benchmark. So it's a bit, two level complication here. But in evaluating or critiquing benchmarks, I'll argue that there are ways to do a better critique than simply accuracy on the line as a as a way of measuring the quality of a particular benchmarking process. Okay, so the way I like to do this is via this taxonomy, which again, this is the semi-tutorial part of it, and hopefully somewhat useful. That goes through, again, some existing work in thinking through how some of the tools that we know how to deploy and use for both the modeling, and I'll say a bit about measurements and distribution shifts. So of course, the first question is, should you worry about distribution shift? This is a sort of fun one. You may say yes or no. If you say no, I'll ask you, are you sure? And I'll force you to go back to the first question. so I will say as I go forward that I'll separate the question of whether you have distribution shift from, is this something you should pay a lot of attention to? And hopefully by now I've talked this distinction is there. But I'll argue that in almost all real world tasks, there is some kind of distribution shift. Now, whether it matters and affects your problem may or may not be true. Again, we'll go through it. But the argument or the claim, the broad, strong claim is there's almost always distribution shift. And so if there is, then you should maybe be thinking about what to do in that setting. So between where I train my model and where I choose to deploy it in context, the argument is there's almost always going to be some systematic difference. And if you're not aware of it, there are cases where it can hurt you. And depending on how far away you're looking to extrapolate, they can hurt you a lot. That's the main story. Okay, so going from there, suppose you agree that there is some, you might then think about what kind of shift it is. And that's I'll frame out a broad set of shifts that you can think of as interpolation shifts. And in those settings, I'll talk through what is called empirical risk minimization. It's a semi-technical term if you haven't heard it. It's effectively machine learning 101. So it's this idea of I have a large data set, I have some loss function, just train your model to minimize the loss function. I'm not doing anything special. I'm not building some sort of specific mechanism to handle distribution shift. It turns out that if your problem looks like interpolation, machine learning 101 is actually a good strategy and maybe connected to things like foundation models. So I'll go through that story very quickly. So interpolation, one way to think about it is that you have data from multiple training environments, and the prediction task that you're interested in looks like a test setting that is in the technical term is convex hull. You can think about it as your test data points can be sort of well explained as, say, mixtures or combinations of your training data points. So things are sort of close enough in this semi-intuitive way. And if you're in those settings, what we found is that you can use, again, the standard machine learning approach. So again, called empirical risk minimization. Have some average loss thing. I'm going to train, pick your favorite model, your deep learning model, your random forest, your sport vector machines. We stopped teaching sport vector machines in the machine learning class, by the way. Fun. But I wish we would teach again. It's fun math. But anyways, whatever machine learning model you like, apply it. And the argument is that this approach will work. And in fact, it's a bit of a stronger argument. I can even try to be adversarial. And adversarial here means, I get to do this convex hull thing. Convex hull you can think of as a mixture of your training data set to the test data set. Pick the worst mixture. So pick a mixture such that it's as extreme as possible within the training data set and sort of place the test set at this extreme point. And it still turns out that empirical risk minimization is good. So it's sort of a quite strong guarantee, and the paper talks about this, and so kind of fascinating and explains a lot about some of the successes that we have seen. And I'm going to argue that a lot of successes, particularly in foundation model world, are highly suggestive of the fact that many of these problems look like interpolation problems and not extrapolation problems. Now, this is all well and great, but we often want to solve problems, as maybe I'm arguing, that don't look like interpolation problems. And so we often think about these as extrapolation problems. One place this shows up, for instance, in healthcare broadly might be that I'm interested in training models in North America, applying them to completely different demographic settings, say, parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, where I expect to see, or expect sort of lots of differences through lots of different compounds between where I train the model and where I deploy it. And so the extrapolation question, and one that's sitting out there is sort of, when is it safe to do this? Like safe in the sense that I expect my model to do something reasonable. When I train in a certain context with, say, certain demographics, and then apply in a different context with very different demographics. And the claim we made here is that this is no longer an interpolation problem, because explicitly the test setting that you're interested in is very far from the training setting, and it could be a worst case style extrapolation problem. And if you care about things like equity and fairness, these kinds of problems show up because, again, you're interested in building models that can be used all across the world, and so there's something that because there again lots of needs for potentially AI tools to help in various kinds of settings, and so this is something that you might worry and try to think of ways to solve. And so here, this puts you, down this path. Let me see where we are. Work, not working. That's fine. This puts you somewhere here. We didn't know a good name for this. I'm calling this average case. It's not that important. I think the key idea here is, do you have data from the target task or not? And if you do, it turns out that, again, the fine-tuning thing that I started off saying turns out to be a pretty good approach. And maybe the additional wrinkle is that we know a little bit more now about why this is a particularly good approach. So the argument is, it turns out that, of the many things that foundation models do, one of the things that they do really well is that they learn good features. And so learn features that sort of capture the essence, if you like, of the problem that you're looking to solve, such that if I have enough target data, I can adjust the model's final prediction to sort of capture well the target task. And so this is, if you like, a good setting, the setting where I have lots of data and training. It's not aligned with the test task, but I have enough of it that I can train a large foundation model. The claim being made here is, if I do this, then I'll do a good job in learning the features underneath the model. And then if I do fine-tuning with the target task, this will typically do a good job and actually sort of good predictions on the target task. So this is a version of tackling the distribution shift problem when I have data at the target. So one of my favorite examples of this is this work in STAIR 2023, where they looked at robustness to spurious correlation. So again, a kind of distribution shift like the tube thing in the example from the beginning. And what they showed is exactly what I said. So I take our existing model, I fine tune the last layer. What is maybe interesting and perhaps crucial here is that their baselines are the result of lots of smart people spending lots of effort building very bespoke models for tackling distribution shift. Including in this setting. So in this setting where I have target sort of test data. And the main claim being made here is I can do as well as all the special stuff that we thought we were doing that was clever to do about fine tuning the last layer for various kinds of spurious correlation tests. And so it's an excellent paper, it's worth taking a look, but provides strong empirical evidence. And then I'm showing some other papers that talk through, the one at the top, talking through some of the theoretical evidence, suggesting that this fine-tuning paradigm is actually a sort of, if I have data in the target, it's actually a pretty good strategy for getting me to sort of do a good job in prediction. On the left, I'm showing some examples and some of the from colleagues here. Some of you here have been part of this, building some foundation models in healthcare. So kudos, I think, useful approach for problems where foundation models are appropriate. I mistakenly left a slide that I meant to remove. Okay. There's another, I think, super interesting, maybe extension of this idea when interested in, again, various kinds of fairness and bias problems. So this paper does a fine-tuning, but a special kind, because they're interested in bias questions when the fairness of bias mechanism can be explained as a spurious correlation or an underrepresentation. And what they show is that I can adjust or construct a test data set that undoes this spurious correlation or this underrepresentation. And if I fine tune to that test data set, this actually also solves the, this is a version of the distribution shift problem, but now specifically targeting the sort of fairness bias version of the problem as opposed to pure performance. But I want a model that, again, I'm interested in demographic behavior. I want a model that behaves similarly across different demographic groups. What they show is that a solve for this problem in many cases is construct a adjustment data set that fixes the problem that you're interested in. Again, this is not for every particular fairness case. This is fairness cases where the fairness gap is explained by spurious correlation or explicit underrepresentation. In those cases, again, fine-tuning actually can be a solve for this problem. So I think it's a clever application of this idea. Okay, so we've gone through most of this graph. We're right at the end. We've gone to the mathy part. So we've gone through, almost definitely you have a distribution shifts problem. It's gonna look like some interpolation thing or some extrapolation thing. It looks like an interpolation thing. It turns out like standard machine learning actually is a pretty good approach for you to use. It looks like an extrapolation thing, but I have data. I can do fine tuning. It turns out that it's also sort of provably and empirically a good approach for solving many of these problems. But then there are lots of problems where the standard setup that I have doesn't hold. Either I don't have data, label data in the target task, or foundation model is not appropriate for whatever reason. I need something that's small and sort of can deploy maybe on device in target setting. And so the standards, quote unquote, straightforward method breaks. And so in those settings, some of the best tools that we have are broadly under this idea of domain adaptation. And mostly what they do is that they exploit structural knowledge that you have about the data distribution as a way to fix various kinds of distribution shift issues. So there are lots of them. The most popular ones are covariated label shifts. So the idea here is I get to see my training data. This is the PXY thing. And I get to see only features in the test setting. I don't get to see labels in the test setting. And I want to figure out a way to fix this distribution shift problem in this particular context. And so there we can use sort of algorithmic tools. And so in particular, covariate shift is the setting where the nature of the shift is that my input distribution changes, but the relationship between the inputs and the labels don't change. And so in those settings, it's called the covariate shift. And sort of one of the settings that we have good understanding of and sort of good tools to solve. There's also a label shift setting. So there's a setting where the label distribution, so this is my marginal distribution of, say, prevalence of a particular disease, for instance, is changing from a source setting to a target setting. But the mechanism, in this case, is anti-causal. So the symptoms, one good example might be like, there's a particular disease, the measurement is not, say the features that I'm using are not necessarily causal symptoms, but they're like measurements after the fact. So yeah, the causal arrow is going in a different direction. Anyways, this shows up a lot in those settings. Standard shift approaches end up being good. I'll try to give some examples again in a little bit. And in particular, if you're not familiar, most of these approaches boil down to trying to reweight distributions so they look like each other. So I try to if I'm in a covariate shift setting, what I try to do is sort of massage my test distribution so that it looks a lot like my training distribution. And once it does, then I can use the label, the performance, so the model that I already knew how to use in the training setting. So I already have a model that does prediction from X to Y. I know that the distribution of X in the source is very different. My features in the source are very different from my features in the target. I find some mechanism to make my target distribution look a lot like my source distribution. Once I do, then I can use the model I already had. And it turns out this is a good solution for this problem. So a bunch of weighting stuff you might have seen, various kinds of propensity weighting, that kind of stuff. If you've seen that before, if you haven't, they're good tools for this. One, I think, more recent approach to solve this problem is to use various kinds of adversarial training approaches. So learn the weights via some kind of adversarial approach. And again, this works. You can use a similar strategy if you're interested in the label shift setting. So same idea. I want to make my marginal distribution of the labels look similar in the train and targets. And so I just find a way to do the massaging. They're, again, good reweighting strategies to solve this problem. I think one of the more exciting new directions in this broad idea are some of the approaches that try to use context as a way to further improve how you might deal with covariate shifts and various kinds of shifts. So the idea is that, when as I argued and I talked about at the beginning, foundation models I'm training over a large combination of distributions. You can think about this as, I have a bunch of different Gaussian balls. I am training over the combination of all of them. You're familiar with distributions. If you're not, it's just enough to think about this as I'm training over a combination of data sets. And so what the model gets to see is this agglomeration of all the data sets and can't necessarily tell them apart. And the argument made is that you can come up with a training strategy that instead of trying to build a good predictor over everything, it actually tries to narrow down a particular distribution and train a good model with respect to that particular zoomed-in distribution. So there's an argument that says when we do prompting and prompt engineering in language models, this is sort of potentially what we're doing, is that we're going from general to contextual by adding the prompt in a certain way. And you can actually apply this, you can think about it as an explanation for why prompting can be effective, and also actually explicitly build models that use this idea as a way to sort of target distribution shifts. So it's tied to a broader notion of something called marginal transfer learning. But in particular, sort of, it's been shown, I think it's a very clever approach to use some of the modern technology to handle even more bespoke and complicated settings of distribution shift. While this is useful, it doesn't always work. So I wrote a paper, I guess now 2 years ago, didn't feel that long, where we showed that many shifts in healthcare settings don't look like covariance shifts or label shifts. And so while these are the dominant mechanisms that people have designed for trying to handle shifts, it turns out that if you try to look through and explain many of the shifts in healthcare settings, the assumption that the shift is well explained by label shift or covariance shift is too strong, and it breaks in many healthcare problems. And so we need richer approaches to think about mitigating, or richer approaches for modeling the kinds of shifts, and then richer or alternative methodologies for trying to mitigate the shift. So one of the approaches is some work with my group and a few other people. We've been playing with various kinds of latent shifts. So latent shifts here are shifts where the nature of the shifts affects both the input and the output, so everything changes. It's well explained by some latent variable. I don't get to see it, so it's some variable that is actually explaining what's changed between the source and the target. So for example, if I'm interested in pneumonia, you can imagine that pneumonia is the change between different institutions is well explained by socioeconomic determinants of health as maybe the latent variable. And this is not necessarily measured, but is actually driving what changed between the two settings. If I try to fix this using either covariance shift alone or label shift alone, you can show that it's insufficient and will sort of provably break. And so an alternative approach that we showed is if you're in a semi-special setting where I can observe a proxy, so this is some other variable that's a good explanation of what's causing the shift, then there are ways to use this proxy to come up with new sort of mitigation approaches that provably improve over both label shift and covariance shift to solve the problem. So I won't have a chance to go into details. I'm showing a couple of papers, somewhat technical, but we have code also available that I can point to that you can use, where we show, I mean, the main bottleneck here is this is a more complicated shift setting. You need more information than you would have needed in either covariate or latent shift, in particular if you have these kind of proxy.
Can you give an example of what like some of your proxies are in this for pneumonia, for example?
Yeah, so here the thing we need to capture is whatever we think is driving the shift. So here, if we think the shift is driven by socioeconomic determinants, the things like age, zip code, other kind of environmental variables are good proxies. So that's what we use in the paper. Great question.
Can you clarify concepts? Is that the
Oh yes, so this is also, we don't know if this is, okay, so this is important to state. I didn't say it because, well, let me actually just go through the argument. So in the paper, we also show that if I have concepts, it makes the problem easier. What we show that we can solve the problem if I get to see proxies and concepts. We think the concept stuff is a artifact of how smart we are, and it's not necessary for solving the problem, but we don't have a solve for that version yet. So what am I saying? I'm saying the current approach that works, where we have mathematically rigorous tools, and settings where I get to see, thanks for the question, by the way, gloss over it, but where I get to see both proxies of the latent shift and concepts. Concepts here are sort of featureized explanations of the input. And if I get to see both of those, then I have a way to engineer a mitigation for the shift. I guess I'm arguing separately that I think the concept part of this is a bit of a red herring, but we don't yet have a good solution without the concept. So right now we need both. We're working on what we think may, like settings or approaches that may not need the concept at all, and we just need to observe proxies. I should also say separately that if I don't get to see either the concept or the proxy, you can provably show that this is an impossible problem to solve. So there's actually math saying, at least in the worst case, like there exist settings where you cannot solve a problem without seeing more. There will always be some shift that will break your model. Okay, so far, I'll speed up a little bit. We've mostly talked about adaptation for domain shift problems, which is, I know something about the test environment. I don't have complete information, but I have, say, marginal distributions of various kinds, or just data, unlabeled data from the targets. And we've gone through a few different methods for specific modeling assumptions that allow me to mitigate shifts in those settings. But there are also settings where I actually know nothing about the targets, and I'm interested in domain generalization. And so this is the technical term is domain generalization. The idea here is I want to be able to be robust to a shift that I have no proxy information for. I have no access to what's going to happen in the test. So one way to think about this is I want to be robust to the worst case shift that I might see in a sort of target setting. So I'm going to argue that it's harder, but all hope is not lost, and we're slowly making progress on approaches that could engage with this problem. So again, sort of worst case shift setting. Here, we think it's even less likely they can get away without making strong modeling assumptions, in particular the causal graph kinds of approaches. There may be another approach where so far our tool set has been mostly built using causal graphs. I'm willing to argue reasonably strongly that you will need something essentially equivalent to solve these kinds of problems. But this sort of as far as we've gotten in this engagement so far. What does this look like? So in our pneumonia example, you can imagine that there are two sets of features. There's a set of features that are stable, and think about this as causal. These are actually important for the prediction task. They're mechanistically sort of in the path of explaining what actually the model should be predicting. So I'm interested in the subset of these two sets of features. They're stable features, say the actual collapse lung, which is a true thing that is tied to the prediction and the diagnosis that you're looking to make. And then there are some other features that are spurious. So they're features that are correlated with the prediction because the data you have, because of sort of something else in the environment, but not actually truly causal. So we think about these as unstable features. And so you're interested in a methodology that can help you isolate the stable features such that you make good predictions, no matter what happens, whatever test domain you apply these to. So what we did in this paper is that we tried to look through, if I'm in this setting and I can think about this as X, Y, some source of spuriousness, and the separation into spurious and non-spurious variables, what are all the graphs that make sense? And so we actually tried to do an exhaustive expansion of sort of all the causal graphs that make sense. And we showed that, at least from our version of make sense, there are sort of roughly three families of graphs. There's a graph that sort of looks like this. It's a causal prediction from the stable features to the outcome. There's an example up top, which you can read. I'll just go through quickly because I have 4 minutes. There's a second graph that looks anti-causal, a third graph that is causal, and the argument I'm going to make here that you can maybe look in more detail in the paper is that in settings where I'm interested in predictive machine learning problems, and I look through sort of all of the causal graphs that don't use additional variables, so that can be fully expanded in terms of stable features, unstable features, and sort of input-output relationships, that all of them are well captured by one of these three graphs as sort of the graphs that make sense. And the main contribution in this work is showing that there's a way to construct a new kind of regularizer that will identify for you the robust features in this setting. And so we construct you can think about a constraint, a sort of causally inspired constraint or a causally inspired regularizer. We show that this will actually provably select the true causal variables in this problem and actually help you do sort of much better job in worst case. So here are a few benchmarks looking at sort of which model, looking at a bunch of different models and then worst case distribution shift within evaluation benchmark. It's worth cautioning here though, that while this helps you in the worst case setting, it comes at a meaningful cost because in the training domain, you will do in general worse and sometimes a lot worse. And I think the reason, one way to explain the reason is that there are lots of correlates of the predictor that are actually helpful for the prediction task. They're not causal, they're not actually the sort of in the path of the true explanation. But I don't know, people might like my cartoon but I still better than what I'm saying. Now that I'm looking at it, I think a less interesting cartoon in the future. Anyways, so the models pick up on all the correlations. Any correlation that's helpful for prediction, always use it. And it turns out sometimes that there's sort of lots of correlations that are helpful for prediction. They're not actually truly causal variables. If you're only going to deploy in a setting that looks like a training setting, it actually may not be worth it to try to get truly causal predictors because you pay a high cost for this. Okay, I want to spend 1 minute on benchmarks. The main claim here is that we can show provably as well that accurate line is actually a bad thing to look for if you want to check for worst case. So if you build a benchmark, you test your training predictors, you test your out of sample prediction, and it looks like there's a linear correlation between the models in domain and the models out of domain. It suggests that you're not actually building a good enough benchmark. It's actually the main claim. And in particular, you want to be looking for inverse correlations or patternless, like no pattern between the input and outputs, if you're interested in a benchmark that truly tests for worst case out of sample prediction. Okay, would a minute over work? If not, I can.
It might be worth just closing out where we're at now,
Okay.
and then if people want to hang out and approach it directly, I'll
Sure,
let you know.
sure.
1 o'clock meetings will have to run.
Sounds good. I also should run soon. Okay, so I think some fun things. I think there's a fun discussion to maybe have about whether we should be targeting this like out of sample prediction as the main goal, or we should be trying to target internal validity, but like rigorous testing of internal validity. I think there's a fun discussion point to have here that we'll not engage with, but people not in this room, but on this campus have written papers. So it's one of Nick and Drew's papers, they kept talking about this issue. So I think there's a sort of fun, broader conversation to have here. I think evaluation plays a big role in when I'm sort of not doing true out of sample like robustness checks, but I need to make sure that my in-distribution checks are actually capturing what I care about. Okay, so I'm going to end here. This was the main story I was hoping to tell. Hopefully I've anchored and sort of said some of this. So in modeling and estimation, we know a lot about, we know more, I guess, about when sort of good existing tools work. Things look like interpolation, you're golden. If they look like extrapolation, you either have target data that looks like the target task, or you're willing to make modeling assumptions that help you correct for the shift. And on the measurement and benchmarks, if you care about worst case, then we should be looking for other kinds of patterns to build better worst case benchmarks. Yeah, I end here. Thanks for the engagement in the question.
Fantastic. We're at the hour. I actually got to run to a meeting. You're on the same one, but if people can hang out and catch up with you for a Q&A, would that be great?
A few minutes.
A few minutes. Well, you might maybe actually just approach Dr. Koyejo directly if you have a question, and we'll take the discussion there. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.